Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ross, one of the consultants at Cordis Bright, and today I'm going to be walking you through our findings from our analysis profiling the not-for-profit sector. In terms of our research approach, this is a longitudinal analysis that started way back in 2012, and I'm just going to look at the last 5 years of this. It's exploring both the profitability and growth of organisations based on their year-end results that are submitted to the Charity Commission. This time we've looked at 108 charities in total that are delivering adult social care. This is down from 125 when we first started doing this analysis. That's just due to mergers and organisations going bust. And we've categorised them as far as possible by their main client group, so if that's old people providers or autism providers, I'll come on to those a little bit later. And in total, these 108 organisations have a combined turnover of more than £3 billion in 2022. Just to break down the size of these organisations a little bit more, you can see here we've got 22 small providers included, where they've got a turnover of under 5 million, and the largest group of organisations falling in between the 10 and 35 million. And just to walk you through our boundaries, so using those year-end results, we look at income and expenditure and use them to work out profit and growth. We've got here the categories that we use to define where they're sitting within profitability and in growth. So if in terms of profit, if we're struggling, it's less than 1% profit, doing okay, 1 to 3%, and outperforming above 3%. And for growth, shrinking if it's less than inflation for that year, doing okay if it's inflation to 5%, and growing rapidly if it's above inflation. Just to give a quick recap on the last couple of years, if you're anything like me, I'm sure you've been trying to forget about the pandemic, but I think it's important context for what we're going to be talking about in these slides. The first lockdown happened in March 2020, then roughly at the beginning of the 2021-2022 financial year, we had the Rule of Six that was introduced, and then sort of towards the end of the 2021-22 financial year, we had the Living with COVID guidance, which is when some of those legislative frameworks started to wind down. It was more about learning to follow guidance instead of actually having to follow laws. Throughout this period, though, from May 2020 and March 2022, 1.35 billion was provided to social care providers to help them with some of the issues resulting from the pandemic. And this was at a time when there was a bit of a reduction in non-core activities, or what organisations were actually allowed to do. So there was a little bit more money floating around within the system. We're looking at a slightly earlier period to the ADAS survey, so the 2021 to 2022 financial year here. And as you can see, the average rate of inflation was 3.7% over that period. Since then, skyrocketed and moved into double figures, which will have a really interesting impact on growth when we look at this next year. But still, it is quite significant. When we look at the year previous to this, in 2020, the rate of inflation was at 1.5%, so it's more than doubled. And the year before, it was at 0.8%, so it's 4 times what it was then. So here, we've got some of our findings from the analysis. This is the growth for all organisations as a whole. Just to give you a quick overview of different colours, the red is shrinking, the yellow is doing okay, and the green is the organisations that are growing rapidly. What we can see is quite a big dip from 2021. This is actually the worst year in the period for all of the organisations in terms of growth. In terms of profitability, it's a little bit more of a mixed picture. We've seen things levelling off really from 2021 when there was a big increase in profitability, sort of returning to those pre-2021 levels. But overall, this isn't a bad picture. In terms of the proportion of organisations that are outperforming, it's the second best in the period. And I'll be returning to those charts throughout so that we can just see a comparison between those ones and the smaller providers or organisations by client group. This chart maps out growth and profitability at the same time. Organisations that are in the dark green are high profit and high growth. Organisations which are dark red are low profit and low growth. And what we can see here is actually quite similar trends to the profitability slide, where 2021 was a particularly good year, more organisations falling into those green colours, but things are rebalancing again in 2022. Overall, not a particularly bad picture if you take the anomaly of 2021 out. And this just focuses on those high performers in both high profit, high growth, which are in the green, and low profit, low growth in the red. What we can see is in 2021, there was a large increase in the number of organisations that were falling into that best performing category, and things are balancing back out in 2022. And we are actually seeing a slight more polarisation over the years, where more and more of those organisations are falling into the low performing category or best performing category. And on average over the last 5 years, just 18% of organisations actually fell into that high performing category in growth and in profitability, compared to 27% of organisations which are falling into that low growth and low profitability category. So what are the big messages? Growth, as mentioned, this is a particularly bad year. It's the worst in the period, 59% of services shrinking. Profitability, a bit more of a mixed picture, following the big jump in 2021 as a result of the pandemic, and we think some of that increased funding that was going through the system. Things look like they were turning back to levels, but this is still a strong year, with 56% of services performing or doing okay. I think the real question though is, where are we going now? It looks like some of these trends have started to reset, and it is quite difficult to predict the future, but I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation. I'm going to talk through small providers now. We've often commented on the hardiness of small providers, and in the last 5 years, the percentage of small providers in the best performers and worst performers categories has pretty much stayed the same. Here's just a quick reminder of growth for the group as a whole. Then in comparison, we've got the small providers. A really quite striking increase from 2021 in the number that are shrinking. No organisations doing okay. And as we can see, this is the worst year in the period for small providers. And small providers typically do worse than the group, so it's not particularly surprising that we see this. Here's just a quick reminder of profitability for all organisations. And then we've got profitability for the small providers. We're seeing that similar trend again, where in 2021, profitability was quite high and things seem to be rebalancing in 2022. Again, for small providers, it's not uncommon that they are a little bit less below the group as a whole in terms of profitability, and that is what we see here. Here we're mapping out growth and profitability again at the same time. Organisations really want to be in these three tiles, or particularly the dark green tile, where it's outperforming and growing rapidly, staying away from the struggling and stagnating categories. What we can see back in 2018 at the very start of our period for small providers is that almost half of organisations were in the red tiles, quite a small proportion in the upper green corner. Bringing that straight up to date, a relatively large increase of the number there in the top green corner, over doubling from 8 to 18%, and it's about 10% increase in the number which are in the bottom red-hand corner. So a bit more of a polarisation as organisations move away from the centre and move into either that high-performing or low-performing category. So for smaller providers overall, we often say when it's tough for the group, it's really tough for small providers, and this is what bears out in the figures. It's a particularly bad year in terms of growth. 77% of organisations are shrinking. Profitability, a bit more mixed, looks to be returning to the pre-pandemic levels. And in terms of polarisation, we've seen a few more organisations move into that low-performing category. Next, I'm going to talk about our first client category group, which is learning disability providers. Over the years, we've seen a decline in the proportion which are growing and outperforming, and previously said that learning disability providers are getting better at growing, but worse at making a profit. But it looks like in recent years, this trend has started to change a little bit. So here's growth for all organisations, and then learning disability providers growth. Again, a really bad year in terms of growth for learning disability providers. 70% of organisations are shrinking, and its growth has dropped to its lowest level in the past 5 years. All profitability again, and then learning disability providers profitability. We see again those trends that we're seeing for the group as a whole being matched for the learning disability providers. A really good year in terms of profitability in 2021, and then a really mixed year in 2022, with almost equal thirds in each of those categories in terms of performance. Proportion outperforming in terms of profitability has been lower than the group as a whole for the last 4 years, so their profitability is dipping below the group. Back to the snapshot of 2018, we can see that it's relatively balanced with a few more organisations falling into the upper green category. When we bring that up to date, we've had a bit more of a movement into the struggling and stagnating category for learning disability providers. So overall, it's clear growth has taken a sharp dip. This is the worst year in the past 5, and profitability is a bit more of a mixed picture. It's worse than the group as a whole, but in terms of their performance, the organisations are falling roughly equally into each of those performance categories. And over the last 5 years, the weakest performing group has increased quite significantly, whereas the highest performing group has declined, seeing less polarisation and movement to that kind of struggling and stagnating red corner. Next, I'm going to talk about autism providers. I think the key thing to say about autism providers for the past few years is that it's been a bit of a roller coaster of a journey, always going a bit up and down. And for both profitability and growth, it's really volatile and can be very difficult to pick out trends. And broadly speaking, we have got a bit better at growing but are struggling to make a profit. So here's all growth again, and then growth for autism providers. Here, we're seeing that 2021 doesn't stand out as a particular year as it does in some of the other analysis, but this year we've got almost no organisations in that doing okay category, which might be to do with the squeezing of our boundaries as a result of inflation being higher than it has been previously. It's a bit of a difficult year to pick out something specific here because we've got the best year in terms of the proportion of organisations that fall into the growing rapidly category, but also the best year for proportion that fall into that shrinking category. But for the first time in the last 5 years, the proportion growing is actually higher than the group as a whole. And to look at profitability is for all the organisations, and then for autism providers. The trends in this are just completely different to what we're seeing for the group as a whole. There's 2019 and 2021, which arguably are relatively better years. This year, we're seeing possibly return to pre-pandemic levels, but I think the key trend there is that it's just very volatile and it's difficult to say what's coming next. In terms of 2018, we can see that almost half of organisations were in the red corner, which were autism providers, bringing it back to 2020. We've seen a bit more of a split, more falling into the green category, but we saw previously that's 4 times higher than it was previously. And even though the struggling is still higher, we are seeing a bit of a movement upwards. So just to give a summary of the performance, it's a very mixed picture both in terms of growth and profitability. There's some polarisation when profitability and growth are combined. The biggest trend there is actually that organisations are moving into the green though, so potentially a positive picture. Second to last of the providers that I'm going to talk about today is older people providers. Growth and profitability has declined over the past years for older people providers, and that's probably not what we'd expect given demographic changes that are happening within the UK. Looking at their profitability and growth, just a quick reminder about it for the group there. And then for older people providers specifically, this is a really bad year in terms of growth, the worst in the period. And growth has been improving up until about 2020, from which it's been reducing, as we can see. Just a quick reminder of profitability, and then older people providers profitability. We're seeing quite clear steps every single year in the proportion that are struggling. It's in its highest year and it's been declining every year over the past 5. Just looking at a quick snapshot then from back in 2018, almost equally distributed between those in the top corner and those in the bottom left. Now we're seeing a movement for older people providers into those that are struggling and stagnating. Just a quick summary. This part of the social care market has faced the most challenges really over the last few years with the pandemic, and because of that it's no surprise what we see within the figures. These really do bear out those challenges with a marked deterioration in both growth and profitability. And then the final client group I'm going to look at is mental health, substance misuse and homelessness providers. In previous years, this segment has demonstrated particular challenges in both growth and profitability. Growth has been a bit mixed, more mixed, with some years being okay, some years being quite poor. Profitability, though, has been a real challenge for this sector, but it does look like in more recent years there's been a start of a more positive trend. Just a quick reminder of growth for the entire group again, and then growth for mental health, substance misuse and homelessness providers. We're actually seeing in terms of the proportion that are growing rapidly, this is the highest year. A little bit more mixed in terms of the proportion that are shrinking, but it's a good year for mental health, substance misuse and homelessness providers. The proportion of organisations growing is the highest it's been. Just quick, all profitability, and then profitability for this sector. We are seeing a similar trend that we've identified for the rest of the groups, where 2021 was a particularly good year for profitability, and things are started to dip in 2022, but the dip is much less significant for this particular client group, only shrinking to 48 compared to 55%. So yeah, the picture still remains relatively positive. And just looking at 2018, we can see almost 2/3 were in that struggling, stagnating, 3 red tiles. Moving it up to 2022, we're seeing a lot more movement actually. It's a really positive picture with nearly half being in the upper right-hand corner. So overall, the proportion of organisations which are growing rapidly is at the highest it's been for mental health, substance misuse and homelessness providers, and profitability is also really positive at the second highest it's been in the last 5 years. This tallies with what we've seen in other literature, particularly the ADAS report, which is showing there have been an increase in referrals into these services, either for better or for worse. And here just provides a very quick summary of what I've gone through today. Unfortunately, overall picture is quite a negative one, but starting off with the positive news, we can see that the proportion of organisations which are mental health, substance misuse and homelessness providers is actually higher, the number which are outperforming and growing rapidly compared to those stagnating and shrinking. For autism providers, it's also not a particularly negative picture, almost an even keel between those shrinking and those stagnating. But for small providers and older people providers, fortunately, much more negative, with the balance clearly tilting to those stagnating and shrinking. And some conclusions. Over the years, it's been a common thing for us to say that it's really difficult for organisations in this sector to grow and be profitable at the same time. In terms of growth, what we are seeing, although this is normally an area which is easy for the sector to achieve in profitability, this is a particularly bad year. And we think that that is explained by the increase in the rate of inflation, which is really interesting when the inflation rate is even higher for the following financial year and what that's going to mean for our analysis. It's likely we'll probably come to you to speak about the metrics we're using and whether we need to think about the way that we say whether an organisation's doing okay or growing rapidly. In terms of profitability though, it's relatively positive overall. This is the second best year within the 5, and we think that this is likely that some of that increased funding that happened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is still working its way through the system. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in terms of profitability next year. Just to do a little bit of forecasting and thinking about the future, we said that not-for-profits have prioritised something other than profitability usually. I don't think this is about to change anytime soon and is probably in the name. Funding levels generally mean it's quite impossible to grow, to be profitable and to provide a good service all at the same time. For there to be any significant changes in this, 2 things would have to happen within the system. The first is that we need more money so that services can provide what they do currently provide, but at higher prices. And the second is that providers stop running loss-making services. This is something that's been mentioned quite a few times in the briefing, but unfortunately, while providers continue to do this, it's unlikely that their financial situation is going to change anytime soon.